Good evening. I'm Theo Brown, Director of the McClendon Scholar Program at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. I want to welcome you to tonight's webinar on the topic of after the protests, what do we do now? The McClendon Scholar Program is in its 14th year of hosting professors, authors, and other thought leaders who can educate and inspire our congregation and the community at large to be more effective in our work for social justice. Now, this is the second webinar on this topic, and we're delighted to have you join us. Most of you were present for the first program we had about a week ago with Professor James Forman, but we also have over 100 new registrations. So many people here tonight were not able to join us last time. I just want you to say a couple of things about the program and we'll dive right in. Our program tonight is going to be very interactive, lots of dialogue and discussion opportunities for you also to give input. Here in a moment, I'm going to invite you to give some input, and then later again near the end, we're going to ask for your comments. And then also there'll be a question and answer period. You might want to look, if you're not familiar with webinar, the Zoom webinar, there are at the bottom some functions we'll be using. The first is the chat function, which is open now, actually. And in a moment, I want to invite you to make an entry there. And then there'll be the Q&A function, which we'll be explaining more later, where you can write in your own questions that we'll direct to James later in the evening. In terms of the chat, we want to start by asking you a question. We'll also give you a chance to practice the chat function. Let me ask you this question. If you could change one thing about our criminal justice system, what would it be? What comes to mind? Think of the first thought or two you have and type it in. We'd like to see some ideas from you about what one thing you would change if you had the power to do so in our criminal justice system. We'll be looking at these. We're going to tally them, and we'll be making it part of the report. We were very curious and interested to see what comes to mind of what you think is important to focus on. Now, the purpose of this webinar is the same as last week's, in that we want to give you information and insight about how you can be involved more effectively in dealing with some of these issues around policing, criminal justice reform, and the needs of people returning from incarceration. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to begin with a little bit of a review about what we talked about last week, just a few moments to remind you some of the things James talked about and that we discussed with him, and then to begin to engage in conversation with him. So I'm going to, I'll give you a few more details later, but right now we'll start, and I want to invite Heather Shortledge, who is the pastor of New York Avenue Presbyterian, to give us some context and comments from last week, and then have a conversation with James about some of those issues. And then afterwards, I'll come back and explain our focus for the rest of the evening. For those of you who did not hear an introduction about James last week, there's much to say, but suffice to say that he's one of our country's leading voices for criminal justice reform, and of course, author of the Pulitzer Prize winning book, Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America. So I want to turn it over to Heather at this point.
Good evening and welcome on behalf of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. We're really delighted that you are here this evening. Many of you were here last week on the 25th for part one of this program. If you are new, welcome. We're glad that you're here tonight. And if you are returning, we're glad that you're here for the second part of the conversation. Last week, we had some really engaging dialogue with James Forman Jr. About a variety of topics, and we want to spend just a few moments talking a little bit more about the things we talked about last week, for those of you who were not here, to catch you up before we kind of move forward in the conversation. Last week, we talked I loved the phrase, the failure of imagination, in trying to figure out reforms and policing. So we talked a lot about using the imagination and the failure of our imagination. We talked a lot about history. It was very interesting when James Forman pointed out that we are just 50 years of this side of the civil rights movement, and the history of all that has accumulated to get us where we are. We talked about auditing police budgets and looking at union contracts. We danced around that word, defund the police, and what that means, and if there is better language to talk about that. So it was a very active and robust conversation last week, and I just want to follow up with a few questions with James. First, I wanted to start out with kind of the police culture. We talk a lot about being on this side of the police, but what is it actually like to be a police officer right now? Do we have an obligation or a duty to build relationships with people who are in the police force? I know in the community organizing world, we toss around that phrase, no permanent enemies, no permanent allies. So what should our relationship be with the police as we work for justice and reform? I wonder if you could speak to that, James.
Absolutely. I have tried to start my video, but I'm being told that I can't.
We'll give you a moment to see. There we go. There you are.
All right. So thank you very much for having me for another night of conversation. And, you know, I think what makes this conversation so good is how many advocates and activists and others that are interested in this work and everyday citizens that care about these issues are joining in the conversations. I can see even from the chat that there's a lot of people that have thought, given a lot of thought to this question of, you know, what's the one thing that they would do? So, you know, in terms of your question, I think it depends on whether when you say relationships with the police, I think it depends on, are we talking about the police as an institution, or are we talking about individual officers? Because it seems to me, based on my experience, I know tons of really good, caring people. And there's lots of research that shows that there are many people who go into policing because they want to make their community better. And I'm thinking particularly here about majority Black communities, which is where I have lived for most of my life and where most of my research is based in. But you could also say even beyond that. But, you know, a lot of people, there's a history of being asked to join the police department because you want to make your community better. You want to make a contribution to your neighborhood. And I know lots of officers for whom that is a big part of the motivation. I mean, it's not the only motivation, but it's part of the motivation. And so it seems to me it's really crucial that we engage with police officers like we would any individuals in a one-on-one kind of way, in a caring way, in a way that encourages their best selves to come forward. I also think, as a matter of kind of political organizing and labor organizing, that, you know, there are a lot of officers that don't feel represented by the current unions. They don't feel like when the union speaks and is incredibly hostile, opposed to any measure of reform that defends officers, even those that have done the worst things. I know lots of officers who will say and who believe privately, you know, that's not what I believe, and that's not what I wish my union were saying. So I actually think there is a movement, right? There are labor organizers who are right now trying to help those officers that don't feel like their current union is representing them, find an alternative voice. But I guess I would say, okay, so that's individual officers. But in terms of our relationship to the police as a unit or as an institution, that's where I think things change. I mean, it seems the history of Black America in this country is a simultaneous history of being over-policed and over-punished and yet underprotected. And so it seems to me that our institutional response has to be to get police departments to recognize those historic and present day flaws, and then set up a set of strategies, and we can talk get into more detail, a set of strategies for what it's going to take to change departments, including, as we talked about last week, shrinking departments when appropriate, to achieve those goals.
Thank you. I know within New York Avenue, we've had a pretty heated and robust conversation among leaders as we have provided protest hospitality. So we've opened our building for bathrooms and snacks and water for protesters and marchers and people coming in off the streets. We have made the tough call to not allow law enforcement inside our building because protesters have not felt safe if law enforcement are in that space. And yet we are a church that says we welcome all people and we are not exclusive. And so that feels, it doesn't feel like it aligns with our mission, but how would we ever get those two groups to feel safe together? And how do we work on those relationships?
Well, when you say you don't allow and I don't know the inside of that decision, but you mean that you don't allow them in the moment of the protest and the police response to the protest?
Correct. So if an officer comes to the door and says, "Can I use the bathroom?" We say, "There's a Starbucks or a McDonald's down the street. We prefer you to use that one." We don't let them inside while we have protesters inside our building for hospitality.
Right. Well, the context matters to me. I mean, if you were to tell me that, like, you don't allow police officers to enter your sanctuary, like, at all.
No, please do not spread that rumor. That is not correct.
I would say that's a real problem. But yeah, I mean, I guess the context matters. And maybe it may well be that the protesters feel like your church is the only place that they have to go in those moments. And the police have other options. The police officers are going to be welcome in other places. And they're worried that if police enter your space, they will enter it for the purpose of spying or gathering information. I mean, that's part of what's happening right now. So I guess I don't know all of the details, but I can certainly understand a decision. I could understand a set of facts which would lead to the decision that you've just described. And then I think it's incumbent upon, a church like yours to try to think of other contexts and other ways that you can have people engaged in relationship building. But I do want to say, and I think this is important, we've had a number of decades of relationship building style work. And it's important, it's essential, and I'm never going to give up on it. I'm somebody who, I teach a class called Inside Out, where I have law students that go every week and they study inside a Connecticut prison alongside men and women who are incarcerated in those prisons. And it's transformative educational experience for everybody involved. So I'm quite committed to the notion of building relationships across barriers and across walls. At the same time, I think that one of the problems that has happened in the last 30 or 40 years around police reform is that the relationship building has been one of the only things that's actually gotten funding. So there are opportunities for community relation style programs. There are opportunities for dialogue. But when you have that and then you don't have any accountability, that's not to me, that's not a deal that I'm willing to sign on to. And I think it's a deal that a lot of communities have been forced to sign on to. So I want there to be relationship building, but I don't want that to be the totality or anything like the totality of what counts as police reform.
Sure, certainly. Thank you. For those of you who are joining us from the DC area, you may have heard that MPD shot and killed an 18-year-old yesterday afternoon, Dion K, and protesters are out in the streets. I wonder, what would you say to those protesters, James? What is the response in the aftermath of something immediately?
I feel a little bit reluctant to answer the question with that sort of specificity because I'm not in DC, right? I'm not, I feel like that's a question that really should be for somebody who's on the streets right now and who knows kind of the context. But I guess, speaking more generally, I think that it's often very hard to know in the immediate. I'm a criminal defense lawyer, right? And so one of the things that we learn as public defenders is that in the immediate aftermath of any incident, you never know all the facts. You never know enough facts, right? And so I think you have to be very careful about reaching a conclusion based on facts that you learn in the first hour, first 2 hour, first 3 hour. Having said that, right? Having said that, there are conclusions that can be drawn that are more broad, that are broader and that are more systemic, right? And so the question that I would be asking is, what is the leadership saying? What is the city leadership saying? What are the mechanisms of accountability that exist? What systems exist for the public to actually find out what happened and for there to be an accounting and a reckoning? We know in lots of jurisdictions, and I'm not saying this is true in DC, but I know we have people participating in this webinar from around the country, right? In lots of jurisdictions, there are all sorts of obstacles to actually getting to the truth. There are union contracts, which we talked about last week. There are law enforcement officer Bill of Rights that do things, for example, like say, investigators can't interview an officer that's been involved in a shooting until that officer has their lawyer and their union representative. And sometimes it's a 3 days or 1 week cooling off period. Sometimes they have the right to look at the evidence, all of the evidence, before they give their statement. These are not things that anybody normally who's charged with a crime has the right to, right? If I said to the police, well, hey, look, before my client is ever going to be investigated, you have to show them all the evidence that you have. Police and prosecutors will laugh and would say that's ridiculous. Well, that's exactly what we do in many jurisdictions for police officers. So again, I would tell people to be clear and to be consistent in your demands and to make sure that your demands are broad enough that they will hold up to the truth, regardless of what the particular facts reveal themselves in this particular case.
Thank you. That is helpful. We talked a lot last week about that word defund the police and how that word didn't quite seem fitting or adequate, but it was the best word that we have in the moment. I wonder, we talked about auditing budgets and police union contracts, but how do you actually start moving money out of a police budget? Like, what are the strategies and the steps for doing that, especially for an average person that might be watching tonight that is wondering, how do we do that? What kind of power do we need to build, or what are the first steps in actually defunding a police budget?
Well, I think that there are particular organizations, right, that were shared last week with program participants that are doing that precise work, right? So it's about organizing. It's about getting together with other people in your community who are committed to that cause and going to whoever the decision maker is in your community. In DC, it's the city council, right? So the city council approves the police budget. So you have to go to your city council member and you have to say, you have to show up at the accountability hearings. You have to go to your city council member and you have to say, let's look at our police budget. Let's ask ourselves, how much are our police departments getting that could be going to other social service agencies? Why is it the case that a program like violence interrupters or ceasefire programs or credible messenger programs or restorative justice programs, why are they on the chopping block every year, right? Just barely being funded, can barely survive, have to come back every year to just live? And why is the police budget so guaranteed? So I guess I would say you have to find community-based partners that are committed to this cause. And as a group, you have to find allies on the city council. I know that the chair of the DC council, for example, Phil Mendelson, has been active and involved in trying to think about reform. And I know that there are a number of other members of the DC council who have been quite aggressive in thinking about police reform. So I think in some sense, there is an audience there again in DC. But if you're not in DC, then go to the local Black Lives Matter chapter, right? And go to their next meeting and ask, what are we doing to organize around reducing our police budget and redirecting those resources to social services? So it's not like there's no magic formula. It's organizing in politics. And it's making our voices be louder than the voices of the status quo. But that's exactly what, like John Lewis, we just honored his passing. Well, what did SNCC do? My dad and my mom were in SNCC with Mr. Lewis. Well, what did they do? They did community-based organizing of exactly the kind of sort that I'm describing. So I don't think it's like, I don't think it's not, there's no mystery. It's just putting in the work.
Thank you. And thank you for putting in the work and for making your voice loud enough so that it can be heard and encouraging us to make our voices loud. I'm looking forward to the continuation of this conversation tonight. I will turn it back to you, Theo, to move us along.
Yeah, thank you so much, both Heather and James. And again, a reminder that, we did send out to people who registered last week the information about some of the groups James referred to. We're going to be sharing other information tonight about people engaged in this work, and we will send an email to all of you with both of those lists. So if you're hearing something and you'd like an idea about how you'd like to be involved, we will be following up with even more information about that tonight and in an email afterwards. Now, for the rest of this webinar, we want to focus primarily on the topic of the needs of currently and formerly incarcerated individuals. And we'll be sharing different ways to think about that issue. In a moment, we're going to hear from James Forman Jr., who's going to talk briefly about that and some of the issues that these folks face as they are in prison or as they re-enter society. And then after a brief presentation, Reverend William Lamar, a pastor of the historic Metropolitan AME Church on M Street in downtown Washington, is going to make some brief comments and then engage in further conversation with James. Reverend Lamar is a well-known community leader, and his church is at the center of many different efforts to create a more just and compassionate society. And then after their dialogue, there'll be a chance for you to ask questions. I see a few of you have already asked questions. You can see what others have asked. You can add them. You can like questions if you want to do so. Just click on the like icon, and that helps us to see the questions that you think ought to be priorities. And then after that, we'll share some more information about groups. And then we will hear finally from Reverend Lamar again at the very close of the evening with a word for us about moving forward and getting involved. So as you listen to this topic, keep in mind some of the things we've talked about already in the broader issues of policing and criminal justice reform, but really want to think about those who are in the justice system, the needs they have and how we can respond to that, both while incarcerated and returning. And I urge you to think about two things in everything you hear. What do you hear tonight that's helpful to you? Just keep in mind of that. It'll help you to remember it. And maybe there's an insight or two that you want to take with you. And then I would like to suggest another thing to think about as you hear the various discussions is, what thoughts do you have about how you can help? Some of you are already engaged in these issues. Are there things in addition you want to do? Some of you are concerned but not involved. So be thinking, what can I do to help? All right, at this point, we want to turn back and hear from James Forman. I want to introduce him at some length last week. I'll just say a couple of things and then invite him to share some comments about those incarcerated and returning from incarceration. As many of you know, though he grew up in Atlanta in many ways, he was greatly shaped by his time here in Washington, D.C. and his work as a public defender. So much of his book, those who've read it, is about experiences in Washington. He's now professor of law at Yale and, of course, author of the best-selling book we mentioned earlier, and we shared that link with you. So James, we're glad to have you here again this evening, and look forward to your comments and then more conversation with you.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. And so, I spoke for a bit longer last time, and I'm not going to speak for as long this time because I was really interested in having a bit of a conversation with Reverend Lamar and also with y'all in the audience. So let me just say, and Theo, you I think you framed this well when you said, what can people do? And you asked the audience to really reflect on that question. So I want to think about that in the context of working on behalf of people who are returning from incarceration or people who have criminal justice convictions, who we know have been demonized and ostracized and excluded from so many opportunities. We pile shame and stigma upon them, and we make it incredibly difficult for them to reintegrate themselves and rebuild families and rebuild careers and rebuild lives, right? The things that we all would want to do and deserve to do. And so I guess I want to share one way of maybe a challenge to the audience, and it's a challenge that my mom posed to me many years back when I was in high school, and I shared a story about my father in our last conversation, and so I feel like I want to balance that out a little bit and tell you about a conversation that I had with my mother. So my parents were civil rights workers, and as I mentioned, so that meant we moved around a lot. I went to a lot of different schools. So I was in 10th grade now, and I was at yet again a new school. And when you're in a new school, you don't necessarily know your way around. It was the first or second day. I was in the bathroom, and I saw a group of kids kind of harassing another kid, making fun of this other kid. And I didn't really have the word. It wasn't physical, but it was verbal, and it was vicious. And I didn't have the words to describe what was happening, but I later would come to understand that this boy's it was his emerging sexual identity and orientation that was causing him to be the target of this bullying. I didn't know I didn't have words for it, but I knew it was wrong. And I went home and I talked to my mom about it. And I told my mom everything that had happened. And I then, child of civil rights workers, so I knew I had to have some ideas about what could be done. So, I had ideas for what the principal could do and the assistant principal to make the hallways safer and make our school a fairer place. I had ideas for what my mom could do. My mom was one of those parents who was always up in the school about this, that, and the other thing. And, as a kid, I never wanted her there. Very few kids want their parents to be up in the school. But I was like, all right, Mom, you're always up in the school and I never want you. Here's actually something you could do something about. I invite you. And my mom listened to all of this. And when I was done talking, she said, James, I appreciate you sharing this with me. I'm glad we have that kind of relationship where you would tell me about this. And I appreciate all of the ideas that you had for what people could do. She said, I just have one question. I said, what's that? She said, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And see, what my mom was doing at that moment, right, is what I would encourage everybody in the audience to be doing right now, which is not to give away your power. There's so many people out there that want to take your power. There's so many threats that we have to our power. But there's a way in which we can take our power away from ourselves. We can take power away from ourselves, right? When we look at a problem and we immediately go to, as I did as a high schooler, what other people could and should do to respond to it. So I've really, ever since then, I've tried to live my life with that thought in mind of never voluntarily relinquishing my power to make change, to fight for change. So, all right, that's a way maybe into the conversation, but then let's go a little bit deeper and think about, in particular, returning citizens. What can we do? And I guess I want to start by saying, I think we're going to cover a lot of different ideas. We're going to cover a lot of different ground. But the most important thing for anybody to ask themselves is, what is my domain of control? What is my sphere of influence? Where are the places that I can make a difference, right? In terms of my church, my synagogue, my temple, my mosque, my neighborhood, my school, my community, my workplace, my university. I teach at a university. So let me give you an example of what I mean about somebody thinking about their domain of control. A number of years ago, there was a presentation that the Ford Foundation was doing in a New York State prison. And the Ford Foundation was presenting the work that it does around the world to fight racism in our justice system and to challenge mass incarceration. And there was a group of incarcerated men there that was listening to it. And at the end of the presentation, one of the men raised his hand and he said, thank you for this presentation. Thank you for this inspiring work. He said, I just have one question. I said, what's that? If I got out, when I get out of this prison, he said, could I be hired by the Ford Foundation? And there was silence in the room. Right? And there was silence in the room because they didn't know the answer. And I bet they suspected the answer was no. But here's where we have to give credit to the Ford Foundation. They went back, they scrubbed their HR policies from top to bottom. And they found that yes, there were a whole bunch of exclusions, including exclusions would have kept this person from ever being hired. But they didn't stop there. They got rid of the exclusions. And then they went further than that. And they set up an internship program to try to hire people, including people who have criminal records and who are coming back from incarceration. And they advertised that program among people in the prison community. They became a fair chance employer, right? And there's a national network of fair chance employers. So the point that I want to make is that the Ford Foundation could have stopped by describing the work that they were doing around the world, but they didn't do that. They were willing to look inside themselves at their own organization, at their own hiring policies. And most people that are part of this webinar are part of an organization that has hiring policies. And so one challenge that I would give to everybody is to push your employer to become a fair chance employer. I have, and you all may be sharing this later as well, but I have some resources on my website, jamesformanjr.com, which is a guide to how you would become a fair chance employer. So because other people have thought about this, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a process there. So let me just give you one more example of taking this charge, right, of not giving away your power. Let me give you one more example of how I've incorporated this in my own life. So this past year, we just started this fall. I started a program called Access to Law School. And what that program is we recruit 20 fellows from the New Haven area, all of whom want to become lawyers. And my students and I at Yale teach a year-long series of classes on introduction to the legal system, navigating the financial aid process, navigating the admissions process, mastering the LSAT so you can get the good score that you need to get into law school. Now, when I first conceived of this program and we put out the applications, in the first round, we didn't get applications from many people who were formerly incarcerated, even though I had put on the website specifically, we invite applications from that group. Because as I was telling Heather, I teach in prison and I know the talent that exists in our prisons today. But we weren't getting the applications. Now, one reaction, people said, well, all right, I did my best, right? I advertised, I let it known that people could apply. I didn't get any applications. I'm going to move forward with what I have. But I don't think that's enough in this space, because the group of people we're talking about, right? People who have been incarcerated or people who have criminal convictions, even if they haven't been incarcerated. have been so ostracized and stigmatized that a lot of times they're not going to believe it if you just put up on the website that they're invited to apply. They think it's just good, you're making it up. So I had to dig deeper and go further and do a whole nother round of outreach to all of the organizations and friends that I know that work with folks that are coming back from prison, that work on reentry, and say, listen, we're serious. We want folks, including folks who have been convicted, have been incarcerated, to apply to be in this program. Well, I'm proud to say that we are having our first gathering of the 20 fellows next weekend, socially at my house, outside, socially distanced, masks, and all that. And of that group of 20, we have 5 who are formerly incarcerated. So that's a small program. That's 5 people. I'm not saying that by itself is going to change the world. It's not. But the point is that each of us can try in our domains of control to do things like that. And if each of us, right, if each of us does a piece, then collectively we will go far towards solving this problem. So that's all I want to say by way of opening comments. And I look forward to a conversation from here on.
Great. Thank you, James. We appreciate those comments and look forward to talking with you. We're going to, in just a moment, move into a conversation. Reverend Lamar has got to make some comments and then engage in discussion with James. But we want to take just a moment and start the process of sharing information about some of these organizations that are out there that are doing work in the area of trying to assist folks both while they're incarcerated and when they're returning. So let's look at some of these just very briefly. You begin to help think your own self about what you might do. One group is Voices for a Second Chance. They're a well-known group in the city. They make contact with folks when they're incarcerated, and then they work with families and they help folks when they are released. They use volunteers in the office, and then they have special things that they do with families around the holidays, and that is a real volunteer opportunity. And you see their information there to learn more about Voices for a Second Chance. The Reentry Task Force is a group of community-based organizations and advocates and concerned residents, and some fair number of returning citizens are engaged, and they assist folks returning to the district in a variety of ways. And you see the co-chairs listed there, Isa Mirza and Louis Sawyer, and you can contact them. Next group is the National Association for the Advancement of Returning Citizens, which is a primarily returning citizen organization. They use volunteers up until the pandemic. They were having weekly meetings. Now they do it on Zoom. They use volunteers in halfway houses and various ways, and you can contact their chair, Eric Weaver, at that address. I think, again, we're sharing that to you with you in chat, and you can see it there, and you'll get a copy of this sent to you. And then finally for this batch is the National Reentry Network for Returning Citizens, and lots of information on that website. They're connected not just in the DC area, but in other communities. And they offer a continuum of care and assistance for people seeking to be reentered. So here are 4 examples of really good creative work being done in a variety of ways in DC. Again, for those of you not in Washington, there are organizations like this in almost every community, and most of them are looking for volunteers. All right, we want to continue the conversation now with James, and I want to invite Reverend William Lamar of Metropolitan AME to make some brief comments, and then talk with James about whatever he would like relating to this topic. Reverend Lamar.
Thank you, Theo, and I want to thank my friends at New York Avenue Presbyterian, Pastor Heather. It's a joy to be with you all, and it is a great honor to talk with James as well. James, his talk really resonated with me, especially around encouraging us to do what we can in our own spheres of influence. The prison industrial complex in America is large and wieldy, with large tentacles that are well-funded and politically powerful, and often trying to put our heads around its hugeness can inhibit our ability to take the next faithful steps. And so I really want to celebrate James's depth of scholarship, but his encouragement of us to do what we have to do in our own spheres of influence. The way that some of my friends put it is, we must discern, all of us gathered here and those whom we influence, what are the next most faithful steps that we can take so we ourselves are not paralyzed by how huge this issue is. And also so that we never forget that ultimately those affected are human beings, those in the systems and the families and the people that they love, the ability of them to thrive and to use their gifts, all of that is truncated in this very difficult, and in my language, death-dealing system. And so if we all do what is necessary to take the next faithful steps, new things can emerge. James, thank you for the opportunity to dialogue with you. Please call me Bill. I'll feel more comfortable. And my first question for you is, you didn't arise out of a vacuum. You were nurtured by James and Constantia. And I want to ask you just to say a little bit more about what it meant to grow up in their home and under their influence, and how that shaped you.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. And I appreciate all the work that you do in the city on behalf of these issues that we're talking about today, and a broader array of social justice issues as well.
Thank you.
We need more voices like yours. To answer your question, it's true in a way. Sometimes I feel like, people will compliment you or say, oh, you do this work, and, that's wonderful, or, you should be proud of it. And there's sometimes in which I feel like, well, it's like, if you go into the family business, you shouldn't get, you certainly at least don't get credit for, like, breaking new ground. So I guess in a way, I feel like, by virtue of the fact that my parents raised us, as to be, freedom fighters, right, is the way language they use, right? We were talking about the 60s and 70s here. And so I guess I feel like, yeah, I imbibe that tradition. I mean, the people who are in history books are people that, my parents spent time with. And so there was just this constant, just ever-present sense of the collective obligation that we all had to make this world a more just place. And there was also a constant reminder of the traditions of struggle out of which we came. So it wasn't ever presented as it was not like a sacrifice. It was that this was glorious. Like as a Black person, my dad is Black, my mom is white. We were raised as Black children. And this idea that you come out of these generations of struggle, so it's a lineage that you can tap into and be proud of and carry forward, it was the day to day in our household. It was the books we read, it was the conversations that we had. And I also got to see, over the course of my lifetime, the last thing I'll say on this is that I also got to see some of the changes and transformation that helped to lead to mass incarceration. When I was a child in Atlanta, we lived a couple blocks away from two enormous institutions. We had the General Motors plant was 2 blocks in one direction, and the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary was 2 blocks in another direction. And that's when I was a kid, young. And then when I was finishing law school, By the time I finished law school, came back home, one of those buildings had shut down, right? Doors locked, padlocked, job shipped overseas. And the other building had built an addition. It had built an extra wing, right? And this was happening through my childhood. So and my parents would comment on it. You know, I wasn't the first person to notice the juxtaposition of the GM plant closing and the penitentiary expanding. So I feel like by being raised in that kind of environment, I almost couldn't help but see some of both the challenges that we face today, as well as a path towards trying to meet those challenges.
I'll come back to that. But another question that's intriguing to me, what have you unearthed in your scholarship that has left you the most despondent?
You know, I talked about a little bit about this in a conversation last week, and I'll just kind of touch on it again. I think the thing that I have found, the most despondent has been looking at the generations of Black citizens, Black activists, and Black leaders in many cases who had this kind of all of the above approach to trying to fight crime and violence and make communities safer. They said, we want more money for police and prosecutors and law enforcement, but we also want more money for jobs and schools and mental health counseling and drug treatment. And they said, we want all of this. And time and time and time again, what came back to Black communities from Congress and from state houses wasn't all of the above, right? It wasn't the Marshall Plan for urban America. It was one of the above. It was money for law enforcement. It was money for police and prisons. And then people turn around and say, well, you asked for it, right? Which is true, it is true. In many instances, people were asking for it. But what makes me so despondent is the fact that so consistently for so long, that's the only thing the Black community ever got. That's the only public investment, if we can even call it that, right? And I don't think of it as that. But, you know, the line of government funding that was going into the Black community was the law enforcement line, and only that line.
So conversely, this is predictable. I don't like to be predictable, but what has left you the most hopeful and encouraged your perseverance in your work as you have done your studies?
I guess I'm extraordinarily hopeful about the current generation of activists and advocates who are out there, whether it's protesting on the streets, or whether it's going down to city halls and city councils and mayor's offices and saying, you know, your previous generation had this limited imagination for how you could respond to crime and violence, but we're breaking through. We're breaking the imagination wide open, right? And we have a whole different vision of how we can create relationships within community, how we can create models of restorative justice and transformative justice, how we can provide communities phone numbers and resources that they can access when they need mental health support for that family member, when they need addiction support. In my generation, right, in our generation, the only way to get that was to call 911. And so people did, because they were desperate. They needed something. And they were told, you got to call 911. And this new generation is saying, we got to break free of that model. We have to create a new set of institutions that will be responsive to community needs, but that don't come with a gun and don't come with handcuffs, right? And don't come with prison and jail being the only place they can take you for treatment where there is none. And so that aspect of it I find, you know, the very fact that they look at me, they read some of this history and they say to me, like, I can't believe people believed the things that they, you know, I can't believe that somebody would call the police because there was somebody who was strung out in the alley behind their home. We have to have a new way of dealing with that. That inspires me.
So you mentioned something that was near and dear to my heart, and that is there is no magic wand. We have to engage in politics and organize to change this. Tell me about how you foresee the politics of changing the carceral state in the United States. There are some stories about cooperation across ideological and party lines. Sometimes I think that's overblown, but tell me what you see as far as the politics are concerned.
I mean, I think it's hard to know, right? Because the forces of opposition are real and they are strong. And I think that they have maybe sort of are kind of like had taken a step back in this moment, and they're kind of hoping that things will blow over and the conversation will shift and they'll be able to go back to kind of the status quo, and that people will move on, and these activists that I described will get tired, they'll give up, they'll get burnt out, they'll find a new issue, right? So I don't want to underestimate the scale and the size or the strength or the guile of the opposition, right? Having said that, you know, I am fundamentally optimistic because we are in the midst of the largest protest movement in my lifetime, and you know, depending on how you measure it, some people argue, you know, in American history. My son is 11 years old, and about 10 days after George Floyd was killed, he said to me, "Dad, how come we haven't gone to a protest?" Now, mind you, right, like here I am thinking of myself as educating him, right, raising him up, and he's kind of embarrassing me about the fact that, you know, and I'm like, you know, in my mind, I'm like, oh, busy and COVID and da, but he just wasn't having it. He was like, we got it. And so we went to downtown New Haven. There were 5,000 people on the green, and New Haven's small, man. New Haven's only got 100,000 people. So 5,000 people are, you know, serious numbers in my town. And it was, you know, all the things we've seen nationally. It was diverse. It was young. It was multi-generational, but led by young people. It was peaceful. It was inspired. It was strategic. People were giving out the numbers of the aldermen and of the mayor and encouraging people to make demands. So I guess I feel like, you know, that if we do stay in community and stay united, and stay thoughtful and stay passionate and keep our eyes on the prize, I do think that it could be the case that we would look back at right now the way we all look back at, you know, Selma and Birmingham and Montgomery and the March on Washington, and as these moments that forever changed American history. But as we talked about last week, the people in those moments, they didn't know, right? The opposition was strong then too. They didn't know that it would be forever remembered the way that it is now. So I am hopeful that 40 or 50 years from now, people will look back at right now in that same kind of transformational, revolutionary, change-oriented way.
So you have communicated with people who organize around the issue, read about it. What kinds of organizing have been most effective? What organizing strategies do you think have built the most power to chip away at this system?
You know, that's a tough question because the strategies have varied so much from community to community. But I guess a few themes that I see cutting across have been that the most effective organizations have been those that have been led by young people. You know, I mentioned this before, but I do think that people of previous generations, you know, our main responsibility right now is to listen. And that doesn't mean you don't input and you don't give advice. Of course, you have to, because that's what it means to be part of a group, a part of a community, as you express yourself. But I think there has to be a certain humility attached to that. And that is to say, a humility that if you're in your 40s, or if you're in your 50s, or if you're older than that, your generation produced mass incarceration, right? And so, you know, you have to be humble as you enter into a dialogue about what to do in response. So they have been led by youth, and they have in many ways been very decentralized, right? And that's a strength and a weakness. I don't want to pass over the weakness part of it. There are weaknesses associated with that, but there also is a strength in that it allows a kind of organic mobilization, and it allows people to find their voice in leadership. You know, if we look back to the 1960s, right, a lot of these shots, you've got the same set of images of leaders, you know, time and time and time again. And this generation right now is saying, you know, we can't make that mistake, because if those leaders get co-opted, or God forbid any harm should come to them, and we know there's a history of that, then, you know, we'll be left leaderless. So those, I guess, are, and I guess the last thing that I'll say is they have been forceful, and I don't mean forceful in by way of tactics. That's actually, but I mean in terms of their set of demands. I think they've changed the conversation about what we could imagine as being possible. We weren't talking about reallocating money away from police departments to other branches of government and to community-based organizations 2 years ago. We just weren't. You know, there was task force and commission and commission, and that was not on the table. So this generation has put that on the table. And I don't think it's going to be easy to take it off.
You mentioned that growing up in your home, you really were fed, if I might say metaphorically, in your bottle, you know, the formula of raising a freedom fighter. So you're doing that work of freedom fighting, and those who have joined us are doing that work, are growing into the work. And as I stated earlier, it's a very complex system, and often we can feel overwhelmed. And I would imagine that as a human being, you could feel that as well. How do you nourish yourself in this kind of freedom fighting? How do you nourish James Forman, and what would you recommend for us in nourishing ourselves and facing such a formidable challenge?
Yeah, you know, it's such an important question, and I guess I think about it maybe in a couple of different ways. I mean, first, there's just like the basic fact of emotional and physical and health wellness, right? There's getting enough sleep. There's finding a chance to exercise. There's not losing track of your friends and your family, right? There's making the time to call, you know, the buddy from college, or, you know, the old friend that you haven't spoken to in a while, like keeping those connections, right? Even when you're busy and feeling overwhelmed. I mean, even if it's just when you're driving home or drive from meeting to meeting. For me, a lot of it is my son. He's 11, so it's going to his baseball games. You know, I'll have a day where I'll look at my calendar, and from minute to minute to minute, I just feel like there's one obligation after another, and they're all going to exhaust me. And then I'll look and I'll see, oh, he's got a little league baseball game at 6 o'clock. And I'm like, all right, all I have to do is make it to the baseball game, and I'm going to be good. So there's those things, right, that we all need to do for ourselves and find out what they are. For me, it's, you know, going to the gym a couple times a week, those kind of things. And then there's, I guess, also thinking about how we do our work, right? And because I think there are ways of doing work that can be more and less sustaining. for me, Brian Stevenson, who I know has given this talk in the past, and obviously one of the great heroes of America, of the world. There's no prize that they give out right now that, in my mind, he shouldn't be getting. He, talks about, right, this idea of proximity, and there are different ways to go with that. But for me, right, the reason why being close to both other people, colleagues in the work, and also people on whose behalf I'm working, being close, being proximate to me is very sustaining, because so often, I mean, you probably get this question every week, every day probably. I know I get it all the time, which is, how do you keep going? There's so many obstacles. There's the opposition is so strong, and you're working against this massive system that seems so entrenched. And for me, what keeps me going is the relationships with individual people who I can see doing things that were not possible in their lives a month ago, 6 months ago. I led off by talking about this Access to Law School program, right, that I've just started. But for me, sitting down, or even virtually for the time being, sitting next to somebody, talking to them about their obstacles that they have faced in their life and the dreams that they still have for themselves and their family, and then helping them chart a pathway for how they can achieve that and how they can thrive, and them seeing them do it. That for me carries me through. That makes me want to go. And so I always tell people, if you're feeling demoralized, the most important thing you can do today is to start doing something. Because the act of doing something, it doesn't matter. People say, what's the most powerful? What's the most impactful? I'm like, I'm not even going to answer that question for you. You do something. You pick something and do it today. And I guarantee you that tomorrow when you get up, you're going to want to do more. That's how I think about it.
James, thank you for fighting with us and for us. Thank you so much. Theo?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, James and Reverend Lamar. It was a great conversation. Wish we could go on and on. In the time we have left, we do want to keep the conversation going. A number of questions have come in. Feel free to add others if you have them. And I'll just pick some of the ones here that people seem to like, and others that seem particularly appropriate. James, one person picked up on the comments you made about education in prison.
Yes.
And they ask in particular, are you familiar with Alternatives to Violence Project, and what you think about that effort, and just other comments you'd make about how we can support education in prisons?
Absolutely. So I don't know that exact program, Alternatives to Violence, but I certainly like the title, and it sounds like that they're doing important work in terms of furthering that work. So the program that I'm involved in is a national program, and it's called Inside Out. And what it does is it trains teachers and professors to teach their classes that they would normally teach at their home institution or home university, but to teach them inside a prison. And there's a very, very if you're in the DC area, there's a very, very powerful program out of Georgetown University that does a lot of work in the DC jail. Mark Howard is, if you Google Georgetown University, Mark Howard Prison, it'll come right up. Maybe we can even find it while we're on this call and put it in the chat. But they do very, very important education work inside prison. I've participated in some of their programming, and I can tell you it's the real deal. I know, Theo, you're also going to be sharing this with people in a little bit, but the Free Minds Book Club is a DC-based organization that does really transformative and powerful work, putting people in book club relationships with folks who are incarcerated. Because I get asked this question so often, I put on my website a link towards volunteering in prison. And that's a bunch of national organizations that you will find there. So if you're not in the DC area, You can go on jamesformanjr.com, click Get Involved. And again, it's not to benefit me. I'm just connecting you to other organizations that are out there that are doing this work, so you can find resources there. So what I would say, and this goes to my conversation with Reverend Lamar, which is that if you do get involved in one of these programs and you find yourself doing tutoring or doing mentoring or doing an education, doing a letter writing program, I think that one of the things you will come away with is the tremendous power and potential, right? The brilliance in many ways that exists right now, locked up in many of our prisons. And I think that you will find those personal connections very affirming and very rewarding, and it will help you stay in the struggle in the way that Reverend Lamar and I were just talking about. I just call him Bill because that's easier, that Bill and I were just talking about.
Great, thanks. We're going to be sharing some resources about free minds and some others.
Good.
Also, I just want to note that on the chat, Stephanie Coffey from Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria has a post there that some people may want to look at. They've compiled a lot of resources and opportunities. Of course, Alfred Street is one of the great churches of the DC area, and so that I just point that out. Maybe we'll pick those up and add those to the ones we send out, but really appreciate her posting that. James has a question several people liked, Jana Kirkman and others liked it. It's about cash bail. Yeah. And there's an effort to end cash bail. Is that a valuable use of organizing resources, or is it not? Is it a dead end because it creates other problems? What's your thought about that as an issue to focus on?
I think it's a very valuable use of resources. There was an op-ed in the New York Times. Again, maybe somebody will find it and share it on chat. It was called, I think, The Power of Community Bail Funds, and it came out within the past week. And it makes the case very, very, I think, correctly for the impact that these community bail funds can have. Now, DC itself has many, many problems, but DC, one good thing about the DC system is that DC doesn't have the cash bail system that most of the country has. And so I, as a practitioner, that actually wasn't something that I came up against, but I've since learned about it and I've since researched it. And what people should know basically is this, right? We have, on any given night in America, we have about 700,000 people that are behind bars. They're not in prison, they're in jails. And most of those people that are in jails are people that are awaiting trial. They have not been convicted, which means that they are legally innocent in our system, right? They are legally innocent, yet they are locked up. Why are they locked up when they're legally innocent? They're locked up for the simple fact that they cannot afford to make bail. So we have a system in our country right now where if you are wealthy, it doesn't matter what you've been charged with, right? You can post bail and you can get out. But if you're poor, you can have the most trivial charge against you, the most minor charge against you, and you can have what the system even considers a relatively low bail. But you know, if you're poor and you don't have $500, $500 might as well be $1 million. You don't have it. Right? And so you're going to be locked up, which puts an incredible pressure on people to plead guilty, because people plead guilty just so that they can get out. So I think that cash bail funds are absolutely a crucial thing that is happening right now. And what I like about them in some jurisdictions is that not only are they raising money from people to help post bail, but they are simultaneously lobbying to change the bail laws of those jurisdictions. So it's like at the same time, it's harm reduction because you're getting people out, but you're also trying to create systemic reform at the same time. So no, that would be at the very top of my list of things that people on this call should consider signing up to do.
Good, thank you. Yeah, last week we mentioned a group called Equal Justice Under Law. And this is one of the main things they work on. People want to know more about that. Actually, a member of our church is one of the founders of that but good to hear your comments on that. Someone else asked, Cheryl Gravy and then several other people ask about the concept of restorative justice. We hear about that. Is that an approach that might be unifying? Could it be resonate across political differences? What are your thoughts about that movement and how it might play a role in all of this?
Absolutely, it's very powerful. I just want to mention for the DC folks, there's a terrific advocate named Seema Gajwani. She is a lawyer that's in Attorney General Carl Racine's office, and they have been pioneering restorative justice programs for juvenile court in Washington, D.C., run out of the Attorney General's office. As your D.C. folks may know, the Attorney General in D.C. is responsible for juvenile court prosecutions in the city. Adult prosecutions are from the U.S. Attorney's Office, right? And there's a lot of us that believe that there should be local control of that office as well. But right now, that office answers to the president, but the Attorney General is an elected official in DC. Carl Racine is a visionary, reform-oriented leader, and he and Seema Gajwani have set up a very model, really, restorative justice program. So you happen to be in a city that's really at the cutting edge of some of this. Now, if you want to expand out nationally, well, what is restorative justice? So I think the simplest way of thinking about it is, let's compare the criminal justice questions to the restorative justice questions. So our criminal system asks the following questions. It says, who broke the law and how should they be punished? Restorative justice asks a different set of questions. It says, who was harmed? What was the harm? And what can the community, including the person that contributed to causing the harm, do to address that harm? And if you think about it, right, most people that have been harmed, that's actually what they want. They want the harm that they suffered to be acknowledged and to be addressed and to be remedied. They want the chance to heal. What our criminal system has said for 50 years, really for 100 years or longer, but it said to people, well, here's how we're going to address your harm. We're going to lock up the person who did it. Well, if you ask somebody who's been a victim of crime, who's been harmed, if you say, well, you know, as between locking somebody up and doing nothing, what do you want? They're going to say, okay, well, lock them up. I don't want you to do nothing. But there are a lot of people who, when given this other opportunity, right, when given the opportunity to have the harm acknowledged and have the person and the broader community come together to creatively think about, what can we do to restore you? What can we do to help you rebuild? What can we do to say we're sorry? Those kinds of questions are actually the ones that people want to have asked of them, and they want to have the opportunity to answer. So what I would say about restorative justice is not going to completely replace the system that we have now, but it can replace a lot of it. It can replace a lot of what we are doing right now. But we have to create more programs, and then we have to fund them adequately in a sustained way. I would love it if I could get to a point where when you were in Judiciary Square in DC, the Hall of Restorative Justice, right, was bigger than the Superior Court. And the Superior Court was off to the side trying to struggle for funding every year to see if it could get its budget renewed, and being asked a whole series of questions about, well, have you proved your efficacy? Have you proved your sustainability? Have you proved that you can scale up? That's the world that I want to live in.
Great, great. Time for one sort of final question, then we'll go to, want to hear some comments. We'll share some more information about groups and go to closing comments. But someone asked, Wanda asks, just what specific things can churches or other congregations do to help incarcerated people reintegrate into society? What are some of the types of help folks might need or assistance or things that churches particularly might be well equipped to do?
Well, honestly, Theo, I can't really imagine anybody better than you to answer that question, given the work that you have done. And I know you're going to be offering, in fact, I know you're going to be offering your program, the program that you're involved with, and some other programs as a concrete answer to this. But so let me answer it in a more maybe kind of overarching way. Right, we're talking right today about returning citizens, right, and helping them thrive upon their return to our communities. Well, again, this goes to the conversation that Bill and I were having about the scale and the scope of the problem and how it can seem so overwhelming to people. So every year across the country, we have about 1 million people who come back into our community from prison or jail. Mostly it's from jail, and it's because of the cycling. You know, you might be in jail for 3 days, 4 days, a couple of weeks. So there's a lot of people coming back. So it's about 1 million people if you add them all up. All right, now if I tell you, well, we're gonna do something, we've got to do something for 1 million people. You might say, oh man, you know, I don't know what I can do about 1 million. Okay, but now what if I tell you that in this country we have 300,000 churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, right? Religious houses of worship. All right, so now I come to you and I say, all right, I want your house of worship to take 3 people. Start with 3 and say, what we are going to do is we're going to be your home. We're going to be we may become your spiritual home, but that's not even where we're starting. What we're starting is we're going to be a set of resources for you. We are going to be the people that commit to help you get housing, to help you get a job. We're going to be the community of people that's going to commit to help you figure out how you can get back on the internet, help you learn the internet if you've been locked up for so long that you don't even know it. We're going to help you get a license. I mean, these basic things, Theo, and you know this, but if you don't have a license, right, or a non-driver's ID, you can't go anywhere. Your prison Department of Corrections doesn't help. You need a government-issued driver's license. Well, that's going to cost you $30 or $40 or $50. You're going to need a few forms.
Yeah.
If you don't have any money, again, we talked about this before, $50 might as well be $1 million. So it's actually some of the small things like that. Now, if each one of these houses of worship were to take 3, well, now we've got the problem. Now we have everybody, right? We're at 900. A few places would have to take 4 to get us to 1 million. But you get the point, which is that these to me are some of the examples of the things that need to be done. And I think that churches and synagogues and temples and mosques really should be at the cutting edge. And as I said, nobody knows this better than you, Theo, and the work that you have done, which has been so important.
Thank you. That was a great comment, great answer, and a lot of specifics there, you know, to follow up on. We do want to share a little bit more information about some other groups, and then I'm going to call on Reverend Lamar to make some final comments to us. And then we have a sort of thank you to James. We want to offer in some final comments and get a word back from you on some chat. So stay with us. Still want input from you on several things as we draw to a close. But let's look at, again, some information. We're going to email this all to you. But here are a couple of organizations, both actually that James has been involved with. You heard him mention last week as part of his introduction that he helped found the Maya Angelou Public Charter School. And the idea was a school to help youth who had not been successful in other contexts, many who had been incarcerated or were in risk of it. And these schools still operate. And they also operate an academy at the New Beginnings facility, which is for incarcerated youth. And they use volunteers. They in person and online to help in different ways, particularly people who want to be tutors or mentors. And you see Ann Schoolcroft's contact information there. She can give you more information about how to be engaged. Free Minds Book Club, you heard James talk about it. They do really innovative work using the literary arts, creating book clubs, both within facilities where folks are incarcerated and for returning citizens. They do a whole range of things. They use volunteers. They've created some very good ways to use volunteers virtually. So that's another group where you can have really direct impact on individuals who are either currently or formerly incarcerated. Next group then is the Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth. We talked about them a little bit last week, and some of their efforts, and then James spoke to it last week about efforts to revise some of these incredibly harsh sentences that were handed out to individuals, and they've been involved in advocacy efforts. They also help people who have youth who've been serving these sentences have been released. And there's more information about their work, both advocacy and other service work. And then the DC Community Mediation Center does a whole range of things with community mediation, but they have a portion where they do a mediation with justice involved individuals and their families and help them to get ready to reintegrate into society. And if you're interested in mediation, they do a lot of things, and that one project might be of interest to you. And then the final one that I want to mention is a network that James made reference to earlier. It's a network that we at New York Avenue, in cooperation with some folks at Reverend Lamar's church, Metropolitan AME, started about 2 years ago. And what we're doing is trying to get congregations to join this network so that on a regular basis, they get information about clients of public defender service who are returning from incarceration or occasionally still are, who have particular needs. And we share that information with the congregations. And then those congregations who want to respond to that case can. We'd love to have more congregations, churches or other faith congregations to be part of this. No obligation for the number of people you help, but you become part of a network, you learn about individuals, and it's very specific needs, like the kind of things James talked about. Someone needing to get an ID, someone needing to have ways of traveling around the city. Sometimes we raise a small amount of money to help someone keep from losing their home. A number of things. And if you're interested in this, I'm actually the contact for that. You see my email there. I want to mention just one more thing. There's an effort in the district now, it's been going on for some time, to try to make it easier to seal criminal records. And there's some legislation in front of the DC Council about this. We're hoping there'll be some action this fall. And we at Arcan are also kind of identifying people who want to help do that. And it's sort of an advocacy opportunity that we're interested in. So if you're interested in that issue too, you should contact me, and we'll be gathering names and let you know how you can be involved. Again, we'll send this information out to everybody, in the next day or two. But these are some examples, and there are other groups. But there's a lot out there, and I think an easy way to get involved is to pick up on one or more of these opportunities in that way. All right, as we move towards closing, I want to invite Bill Lamar to make some final comments, and then we'll come back for some quick closing announcements and to get some feedback from you in chat. Bill?
Thank you, Theo. In closing, I want to remind us that the biblical record is a story literally punctuated by unjust imprisonments. Joseph, Samson, Jeremiah, Micaiah, Zedekiah, Daniel, John the Baptist, Peter, James, John, Silas, and Jesus. Jesus was held in captivity, in life, and guarded in death by soldiers, afraid that his body would be stolen and his disciples would claim that he had risen, because the empire was frightened. Because if the one tool that they occupied and had monopolized, which was death, if there were rumors that death could be overcome, then their power would have been vanquished. Let me make a major theological point that really has come alive to me in preparing for these discussions, and that is that the resurrection of Jesus is a narrative concerning a returning citizen. That the resurrection is a narrative concerning a returning citizen. Let's also be reminded that prison, by and large, is for the powerless and not the powerful. To be in prison does not necessarily mean criminality. What it more than likely means is that you belong to a group of people considered undesirable by the political and economic powers. Often it is more about your undesirability than it is about criminality, more about poverty than it is about criminality. Just a few more thoughts. Dr. Christopher Marshall wrote an elegant paper entitled Prison, Prisoners, and the Bible. And he lands on these points that I hope will encourage us to get involved. First of all, imprisonment in all of its many incarnations causes suffering, intergenerational, multi-generational suffering. That imprisonment in biblical times and in our own times was an instrument of oppression more than an instrument of justice. That imprisonment is identified in Scripture with the spirit and the power of death. Jesus says that he came to set the captives free, and that was not a spiritualization, but it was literally a call to set free those whose bodies had been bound and who had been locked out of the opportunities necessary for their thriving. And finally, God is in the business of setting prisoners free. There is not one place in Scripture, one place in our tradition where prisons are divinely endorsed. Let me end with a passage of Scripture that I hope will encourage us to go forward. Acts chapter 16, verse 26. Suddenly there was an earthquake so violent that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors were opened and everyone's chains were unfastened. We are called to be that earthquake that will shake prison walls and doors open. Let us go and be earthquakes in the communities we've been called to serve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful words to hold with us. So as we draw to a close, I want to open the chat again, pose 2 questions, and then we have a couple of things we want to do I think you'll find of interest. So the chat is open. We want to ask you to comment on either of these 2 questions. And again, we're going to gather these, look at them, and draw some sense from them about what future work and programs we ought to do. So 2 questions. What was particularly helpful to you in this program? It could be anything, something you learned, something you were inspired by. One particular thought. Secondly, what ideas do you have about how you can help? You've been sitting there maybe thinking about something you might do, a group you might want to contact, or way you could help. So make any comments you want on chat as we open it, and it will be 3 or 4 minutes here as we close. And again, I have a couple of announcements while you are entering your comments. But before I do, I want to introduce Avis Buchanan, who's with us, who is the director of the Public Defender Service in Washington, D.C., to make her own announcement.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Theo. James has been the primary focus of this evening's program, and he is certainly deserving of the award that is about to be presented. But we think someone else is deserving too. So we'd like to turn the spotlight on you, Theo Brown, and recognize you for all that you've done for the Public Defender Service's clients over the last 5 years. So tonight, the PDS Champion of Liberty Award goes not to James, as you've been believed, but to you. At a time of major social upheaval and intense interest in criminal justice reform, it is fitting that we honor someone like you, whose commitment to people dealing with their involvement in the difficulties of being involved in the criminal legal system, you embody that. And the very first PDS client you ever helped was someone back in 2015 who needed access to his funds, personal funds he had, and because of your work, he was able to get that through the assistance of a volunteer because he didn't have any family to help him out in the community when he was in prison. And so you made a positive difference in his life. And one thing you don't do at PDS is let people know how useful you are, because we just keep coming back. And that's what we did with you. And year after year, client after client, you stepped in, whether it was financial resources or non-financial resources, whether it was help paying a bill, help with a phone bill, utility bills, getting a car out of storage, rent. It didn't matter. You didn't say no, you stepped up. And afterwards, you expanded your efforts and you incorporated other organizations. And eventually, as you have told us, although you downplayed your role in this, you started ARCAN along with the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church and Metropolitan AME Church, and expanding those efforts to focus on people who are coming out of prison. And the ARCAN organization eventually expanded to include other churches, and may, as a result of your push today, be even bigger when the churches see how effective you have been, and their members will want to join in the efforts that you are making and have done so successfully. And since then, whether it's clothing, gift cards, mentors, you continue to make a difference. And all these forms of assistance have helped our clients succeed. And they've been particularly helpful during the pandemic, as PDS has obtained release for clients under the district's Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act and the district's new compassionate release law. When PDS calls, Theo Brown answers, ARCAN gets to work, and clients see results. And for all that, PDS makes you an honorary champion of liberty. And so we present you with this award that you will ultimately get, in person. It says, recognizing Theo Brown as champion of liberty for his contributions to the well-being and success of PDS clients, September 3rd, 2020. And so now, thank you on behalf of PDS and on behalf of PDS clients. And I'll turn the program back over to you so you can proceed as you had originally planned.
Thank you so much, Avis. I appreciate that. And on behalf of everybody with the churches in the ARCAN network and all, we really appreciate that very much. You did not make the announcement I was told you were going to make, but it's appreciated. And I appreciate it also as just sort of underscoring some of the work we do. And we'd love to have other congregations join us. So do reach out to me or to Don Craig at Metropolitan AME, those of you who know him, if you want to be part of this and learn more. So thank you so much, Avis. And again, we do thank you, James, for your help and your involvement. I'm happy to announce, I want to mention a couple of other final programs here as we close. We have a couple of other things coming up. We do, in fact, have another program with James Forman, Jr. We don't have the date. It will be this fall, and it's intended as a follow-up conversation. So we can think about this, look at our own efforts to be involved, and have a conversation with James. It'll just be an hour-long time period where we just can talk with him, and after we've had a few weeks to reflect on this and the work we're doing, and we'll get back to you soon about that. And then I want you to know, and we'll send emails to people on our list about another program on another subject. We have Karina Gore from Union Theological Seminary, the Center for Earth Ethics in New York City, coming, I wish she was coming, but through a webinar, she will come to us on September 19th, and we'll send some information about that also. So just be aware of that. Again, thank you so much for your participation tonight. I want to remind you about James's book. I think the link was sent earlier, and we will send it out again. I really recommend, if you've not read it, to get a copy of it and read it. And we will be sending follow-up information to all of you. Thank you so much for your participation. And as we close, I want to say thanks again to everybody who helped, our technical team and the panelists, and invite Heather Shortledge to close with a final word.
Thank you, Theo. We heard from Bill Lamar that we are supposed to go and be earthquakes in our community. And we heard that great story from James Forman Jr.'s mom about not what are other people going to do or what should other people do, but what are you going to do? I hope that you will take those charges with you tonight, and may God be with you. May God be with all of those who are incarcerated and with all of these fine folks who are working alongside them. Amen and amen. Good night.